So I want to start with something kind of specific. We met 8 years ago, almost exactly 8 years ago, weirdly enough. And when I met you, I heard you were a cryptocurrency guy, and I thought, oh God, I don't want to talk to this guy because I've met them before. And they're just like crazy anarchists and talking about this funny money I didn't understand. And within 15 minutes of the conversation, I came to understand the power of cryptoeconomic incentives and mechanism design applied to protocols. Initially, of course, file storage and serving. But then I think within 5 minutes, we were talking about solving world hunger with the same mechanism thing. And to me, I roam the crypto ecosystem still looking for more people who understand this and more people who are building in this way. So I think this is still the center of the whole thing. Yep. Am I right?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that this is like the most important thing that might come out of this entire industry is the ability to program incentive structures that program humanity. So with blockchains, because you get to deploy mechanisms and incentives into the world, you're not really programming computers. You're programming humanity. You're programming organizations. You're programming people. And so, think of the most important graph in all of crypto for me is the Bitcoin hash rate, because it demonstrates how a single incentive structure can organize vast amounts of people, organizations, capital, resources to produce an output. It's just maximizing for one KPI, which is the amount of hashes per second. Totally wasted, which is terrible. But you can do that to do really useful things. Like, that's the central idea behind Filecoin. It's like doing that same kind of incentive structure to do something useful. But you can do that for fixing carbon or increasing solar. Like, Glow is doing that today. And you can solve all kinds of human problems with these kinds of mechanisms. So right now, I think some of the most valuable things that are being built at the moment are those kinds of things. And we'll probably look back 20, 30 years from now as like, this was the important thing that this industry kind of introduced and pioneered. It's a shame to me that like both people in the industry are kind of like missing the forest for the trees, because everything is kind of like way too focused on like the computing side of things, like which is critical and important, and we have to like do that. I spend most of my time on that because we have to like build like the right tools and platforms for everything else. But that's not like the end game. That's not the goal itself. Like that's an important mission, but the other stuff out beyond is like where the real value I think really lies. And so it's really about kind of reprogramming our nation states, reprogramming our societies, reprogramming our structures, and really the sky's the limit. Like, it's just kind of crazy to me how stuck in the current mode of thinking and the mainstream perspective almost everybody is. And like these superpowers are like very adjacent. You can like tap into them and deploy extremely powerful things. It really is magical superpowers that you have through blockchains. And so I kind of like feel like I'm in like this weird world where like, like the tools to like solve a bunch of problems are like lying around and like people are just like can't see them. And I'm like, oh man, like how do we like orient people towards this? So yeah.
Yeah, instead we're using them to launch meme coins and this is not actually a slight against meme coins. I've been running scripts recently to just like watch all the different coins that get launched, and of course with ERC20s and equivalents on other networks, it is trivial to create a new token. Literally, you can create a script that creates scripts that creates the tokens. And that's not the surprising thing, but what I've been surprised by is not that they're happening so quickly that people are jumping on them. And there's like all this economic activity flowing through, which underscores the idea that we're programming humans here, right? Yep. We're programming these degens that are doing this momentum trading.
Yep.
How can we program the degens to do something useful?
Come over to the region side. So Kevin Iwaki has a great observation, and it's kind of spelled out in the Green Pill book, which is that the cyclicality of crypto, the bull-bear structure, actually creates this flywheel of turning degens into regions, which is pretty cool. Like the argument goes as follows: the kind of like bull market tends to be like this degen, like super degen moment, where like that attracts a lot of that activity, and then people start like playing with the tools and playing with the structures, and just like their eyes are open to like the level of power that you have in this environment. And then they start like really thinking about what they really value, which is not the degen stuff. The degen stuff is like, most degens, like those are kind of like proxy goals in order to achieve their real goals. And so they start realizing that they can actually achieve their real goals, and like they slowly start transitioning into regens. And so yeah, I think like that's part of what's fueled the whole industry, which is I think is like, you know, a good trend. It would be great if everybody was a regen from the beginning, but you know, we'll get there.
Is the problem that you sort of have to be altruistic by default to become a regen? Because you can't really sell people on. We've tried for millennia to.
No, I think you just have to like. Altruism is kind of like this weird word that people describe as like a thing you can be that's different from like the normal way of thinking, and like if you just kind of work through it in terms of like understanding physics and biology and like human systems and so on, like you can't not be an altruist. It's kind of like it doesn't make sense not to be. And so it's kind of like just helping everybody understand that everything around you, all human systems were invented and produced, and like they just happen to be effective. They worked, and it's a very path-dependent thing. You can produce other things that work really well. Other visions can work. Sometimes you get efforts that like fizzle out and fail. Sometimes for like, you know, bad reasons, like it just kind of, there weren't enough people working on it, or like they couldn't quite crack a problem. And so it's kind of like really kind of, it's kind of like the seeing the code in the matrix sort of moment of like, oh wow, like all of these structures and systems and so on are piles and piles and piles of layered incentive structures that we've built, social expectations, governance structures, like local norms, legal frameworks and structures, like rights, like the whole concept of rights is really interesting to kind of study how rights came about. Like we invented human rights. Like this is not like and when you read all the documents, they try to assert like, no, these are like fundamental things that exist. And like, we were just trying to like design a new government structure to protect these things that really exist. And it's like, no, like these got invented at a particular moment in time because it was a really good idea to have rights and to produce a much better civilization. So just like that, you can program these kinds of structures and rewire and reprogram how humanity works. And just like, you do have to be clever about it. Like you can't do something that like is more inefficient, takes too much time, doesn't outcompete the current structures. You have to be clever enough to produce something that not only works on its own, in its model, but outcompetes the current structures. So this is one of the huge failures of the 20th century. So the 20th century was like this huge fight between traditional kind of like 19th century capital, fascism, and communism. And the three models like duked it out like across the entire world, like different ways of reorganizing society. And both fascism and communism had like this feature where like they maybe had some of the political theory figured out, but they completely screwed up entirely on how to organize at massive scale. So this is what traditional 19th century capitalism got right. When you're dealing with human systems at massive scale, you want a distributed algorithm that is able to produce results at various different layers of scale. And so the traditional 19th century capitalism worked really well for small groups, worked really well for city scale groups, worked really well for nations. It's not efficient. Like when you compare it to kind of like the cybernetics or like the communist cybernetics ideals, of course, in a central planning environment, you could do better. Like the brain is evidence that a centrally planned thing can actually outcompete a decentralized decision-making tool. However, we didn't have the tools in the 20th century to remotely get close to that, and we didn't have the structure to be able to produce that kind of outcome. So, like those entire systems didn't work out, and unfortunately, leaned into something that is like dramatically worse than everything, which is like highly totalitarian, dictatorial things, where like all of those movements turn into these horrific outcomes, right? And so like people today are very hesitant to rewire and reprogram governments. It's almost like sacrilege to like suggest like different economic models because people are so afraid that we would accidentally cause that kind of like terrible disaster again. And so this is where like we have to be very careful into kind of like try and build things that work at different scales first, show that they work well, show that they optimize for human values, show that they're like producing a net benefit, and then you can like scale them. This is one of the things where Bitcoin is like an example of the power, but also cautionary tale. You deploy this massive incentive structure, you like reorganize tons of people around the planet to produce hashers, and like, man, what a waste of energy and resources. You should be doing something much more useful with that. And so use that as like a learning of like both the awesome power of incentives, but also make sure that you're orienting towards achieve good outcomes. This is what I'm super excited about, things like applying those same incentive structures to like fixing carbon or like building solar or like getting fusion or those kinds of things. I think could be super cool. Sorry if I like took it like way off the deep end here.
No, that's where we're going. Let's go deeper. Now we'll bring it back and get a little more concrete and in the now then. So like along this path, what's like one concrete thing that's going on now that you think is nascent, that people don't see enough and people aren't participating in enough?
Yeah.
That could be really important for humanity.
So I think like in the short to medium term, like in the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years, I think the mechanisms for doing public goods funding allocation is one of the most important things going on. And the reason it's really cool is like, at the end of the day, most of what you see around the world got produced by a set of people working together to produce that thing. And so like currently in the current hyper-capitalist environment, you have to like get funding somehow to produce the outcome. And so it all like, the money flows are like organizing everything to produce those outcomes. And so when you like find new ways of routing money to good outcomes, like that's become super powerful. And so there are lots of problems in the world where like the rate limiter is not ideas or people that want to work on it or like knowing what the solution is. It's that you can't actually assemble enough capital to organize people long enough to actually do it. Fusion is a very good example of this. In the 80s, 90s, people had like all kinds of plans to build fusion, and they just never were able to accumulate the level of capital required to do all of the work required to do it. We're finally getting to it now, like after it's been this long, and you go back and plot out the amount of capital invested and the work done to do it, and it's pretty close to the plans that they had at the time. And so the public goods funding mechanisms that we're experimenting with in the kind of toy environments can be scaled really high. So for example, like a lot of us have been working on retrospective funding. So since like 2017, 2018, a bunch of us have been like realized like, oh, actually, if you use blockchains to reward impact retroactively, it's much easier to route the money to the things that actually produce impact because you can easily measure that. Like you can see what worked, or at least much more easily than speculative impact, which is a traditional grant program structure. And so there's been a number of projects that tried to do it. The original Gitcoin vision was kind of like around wiring incentives through GitHub repositories. SourceGrid was another project that was exploring that same idea space. Over time, things like pivoted and maneuvered to like what was working at the time. Recently, now Optimism like revived that same kind of interest and idea, and now is scaling in RetroPGF. So we're talking about like deploying hundreds of millions of dollars per year into retrospective funding for an ecosystem. Now we're like replicating that structure to support a bunch of other ecosystems. Then Drips is a new tool that launched in the last few weeks or a couple months that is now realizing the goal that Gitcoin originally and SourceGrid had of like wiring incentives and money through the GitHub contribution graph. And so today you can go look at the Drips page and see the amount of money flowing through the dependency graph, which is pretty awesome. You can so that's working today. It's like really cool. But you can take that same idea and apply it to other things. Let's go look at the publication graph in science and just route funding through the publication graph. Nothing is preventing any one of us in this room from spending a few months of our lives building that product and launching it. Suddenly you start wiring up the credit attribution graph, and you have a totally different model to incentivize economic output. You can incentivize impact in a totally different way. There's a bunch of other experiments. So there's a community called Funding the Commons, and the broader Gitcoin community and the broader public goods funding community is exploring like lots of different mechanisms and components. And so we're in like this high experimentation phase where we're testing out lots of different primitives and structures to see what works in what contexts, to then when we find something really good, then scale it. And so I think the OP RetroPGF is one good structure of experimenting many times until we find like a good thing that is working well enough. Great, let's replicate it, improve it, scale it. Drips is now the next iteration of a different way of doing that. There's other ways of allocating capital, but kind of the reason it's so important is that when you look around the world, why do people work on the things they do? Why do people work on the jobs they do instead of what they really care about very deeply, or like what they used to really care about? It's because they need money, they need capital, they need to like eat, they need like shelter. And so you can like rewire and reorganize all of society if you have better funding flows. And so if you kind of like create these money router structures, you can aim them at solving all kinds of problems, and you can get the outcome. And this is kind of like very embedded within the capital environment we have. So if you then start experimenting with like different economic models altogether, that's a whole other trip. Much harder to do, but it's also possible in this environment.
So I want to be a good person, and so do you, and so do you all. You say like you don't have to try to be altruist, sort of altruist by default, but we have this coordination failure where ultimately we buy a TV instead of putting it into drips, right? Or so like where is the top of that funnel of money, and how in a hyper-capitalist environment can we incentivize money going into it?
Although I would say I wouldn't fault us for buying the TV, because like buying the TV is like also driving a lot of R&D into like all kinds of key fundamental research things in optics and so on. So like maybe like there are some very spurious, like your point is like there are these spurious expenditures that maybe we should be like routing a different way.
Our fourth TV, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of weird.
Fifth TV.
It's like, so people always talk about like the level of waste in our consumerist economy, and I just like, I don't think it's true. Like all of the production that we're doing, at the end of the day, like the money that you paid in the TV went to a set of people that are manufacturing that TV, and then they're like able to live off of it. So I agree that you could probably have a higher leverage way to spend that fourth TV money. Maybe the right way is drips to pay for your dependencies, but I would maybe work on like finding ways that your economic output, like the things that you work on, directly connect with the things you depend on or the outcomes that you want to see, and like route it that way. Like I don't know. Like I think your like marginal capital should go towards like the things that you really, really care about. So yeah, maybe it's not the fourth TV, maybe it's like this open source dependencies, but maybe it's like funding, like angel funding a whole set of people trying to experiment with these kinds of mechanisms and so on. I do think that like angel investors, like the traditional term of an angel of saying like, oh man, this is a crazy idea, could be really awesome, like doesn't quite make sense for VC yet, like there's no strong business yet, but man, this is like such a compelling vision, such a compelling team, let's go give them capital. It's like such a key part of making the world a better place. And it happens to be aligned with a regenerative loop because there's investment capital available. Now, it's super risky relative to like traditional VC. But there's an even riskier part earlier than that, which is like even before there are startups, there's just a bunch of work that has to be done to like translate good ideas into technologies that could be put into a product. That part is the area where like I'm super focused on trying to improve. This is kind of like an area that Bell Labs used to call fundamental development, which is kind of like how do you go from like research insights into something that you can actually put into a product and sell. So this is before there are startups. And like that's the area that is super underfunded. And you can use a VC model to fund that area, but it would be way cooler to find native investable assets that we could deploy there. I think IP law is like, or like IP as a transaction is totally broken. And I kind of like, I've been trying to think of it in terms of like an Airbnb type situation where like the Airbnb team looked around the world and they were like, man, there is so many rooms in the world that are unused. Like what the hell is going on? And they realized that the transaction was broken, and they fixed the transaction of trying to stay in somebody's home by creating a good marketplace, reputation system, incentive structures, and they just totally transformed the world. And you can probably do that to IP. IP is like, I come from an open source background where IP is like this horrible thing that like prevents people from doing good things. And in the pharma world, it's different. In the pharma world, IP is actually the only thing preventing like the predatory pharma groups from just stealing scientific insights. And so IP is like the thing that protects the small lab in order to be able to sell the company to the pharma company so that you can get more money to like do more science. And so there's something like fundamentally broken about IP as a structure. Like for example, it shouldn't be possible for IP to prevent humanity from using the thing. Like the excludability thing is like crazy. There should be a price. Like you shouldn't be able to prevent, cures to diseases. But like maybe there's something about like creating a new IP marketplace that could like radically transform that structure and create a new incentive in that layer. Or do the credit attribution graph thing. That's a different incentive model. Just let's experiment with a bunch of these kinds of things. And there are groups doing this now. Like, Molecule is one that's doing IPNFT type structures. DeSci Labs and Radical and others are like working on the credit attribution graph. Yeah, and there's probably like 5 or 10 other models that we could try. And so we need to like stimulate this part of the pipeline and this part of the experimental space.
Time flies when speaking to you. We are at time. Is there one concrete thing you would tell this room full of brilliant technologists to do today or tomorrow to like get started down this path?
I would say like legit take a fraction of your time, like come up with a percentage, like 5%, 10%, 15%, and just start spending it, legit calendar level, like block it out, learning about what's going on and seeing the experiments and trying to understand the landscape. There's, read the Green Pill book, go watch the podcast, go try out the products, like give feedback when something is broken, or try to help the teams, and then think about how you would use that in other contexts, and stay abreast of what's happening. And if you can help those groups achieve better outcomes, we can get to like a super scalable thing. Maybe the other thing is like concretely as a builder, if you're building a crypto network today, like take a portion of your token allocation and declare it to public goods. So like, I wish I had done this for Filecoin. Thank you. I wish I had done this for Filecoin initially. I just kind of like wasn't smart enough at the time. Like I didn't have like the right knowledge. If you take like 10% or 20% of your allocation and route it to public goods in the long term, or like some percentage of your emission yearly, then as the thing you're working on becomes more valuable and you scale, suddenly you start driving tons of funding towards like really good things. And of course, your public goods funding should orient towards like the things that your network and ecosystem benefits from, like optimisms. But over time, as you succeed more and more and more, like your aperture, your cone of what you can fund, like grows and enhances, and you start looking at other things. Like you start funding like R&D that's critical to your thing. You start funding like the communities that like leverage your thing. And so I think that's probably such an important thing for anybody working on any token network today. Like just route a fraction of your capital now towards public goods funding, so that when you succeed and you scale, you have an extremely good outcome. Think about what would have happened if like Ethereum had done this with the emission and like it was just kind of funding public goods at massive scale. Cryptocurrencies are going to increase in value tremendously. Just go look at there's this great, amazing. By the way, this is not financial advice of any sort whatsoever. Like disclaimer. Fuck. There's this great graph called like the visualization of all the world's money, and it just shows you the different assets and the scale of them. And crypto is tiny compared to like real estate and debt and gold. Just the value of gold, which is so stupid to me. And all derivatives. And so crypto is like less than 1% of all derivatives. And so like when people talk about like crypto being inflated and so on, it's like, man, you don't know what the real capital asset base really is. Like, what would happen if all the houses went into the market right now and had to be sold? Oh man, is that house really worth that much? I fucking doubt it. So like you have these totally inflated asset prices in these other environments. Crypto is like on the rise. If crypto becomes 10, 100, 1,000x more valuable, and the crypto networks that become really valuable are routing a bunch of their capital to public goods, you could actually fund public goods at larger scales than governments. Governments fund a lot of public goods. That's kind of why they're there. But it's not actually that much money when you really look at it. So if you take the tools of technology capital and route them towards public goods funding at massive scale, that just completely transforms the world. And so, yeah, I would do that. Just fight for whatever token network you're in to route like 10 to 20, maybe more, percentage of your emissions into public goods.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Juan.